History often turns not on centuries, but on hours. Entire empires can rise, fracture, or vanish in the span of a single afternoon. What you're about to hear is one of those moments, quiet at first, almost unremarkable, yet powerful enough to redraw borders, end ambitions forged over generations, and alter the balance of Europe itself. This is the story of how one day on the banks of a forgotten river decided the fate of an empire. Let me begin this story properly, because what follows is the account of how a single afternoon determined the course of an entire war. This was the Great Turkish War, a conflict ignited in 1683 that set the Ottoman Empire against the Holy League, a coalition led by the Habsburg monarchy. For more than a decade, Central and Eastern Europe had been consumed by relentless fighting over land, authority, and survival itself. And then, at Zenta, everything converged. What unfolded there became the war's decisive turning point. In one brutal stroke, an Ottoman field army was annihilated, centuries of steady expansion came to an abrupt end, and the political map of Central Europe was quietly but permanently altered. From this moment emerged what later generations would call the Eastern Question, a geopolitical dilemma that would trouble European powers for more than 200 years. Although the story begins outside Vienna in 1683, the destiny of an entire era was sealed years later along the banks of the Tisa River. So if you've ever wondered how a single afternoon can reshape the fate of an empire, stay with me. Over the next half hour, we're going to trace exactly how that moment came to pass. Everything truly begins in 1683. Beneath the walls of Vienna, when the Ottoman army failed to capture the city and suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Columburg. The impact was psychological as much as military. For nearly 2 centuries, Ottoman forces had advanced steadily into the heart of Europe. Now, that momentum stalled and then violently reversed. Once it broke, the reaction was swift. From that shock emerged the Holy League, an alliance that brought together the Habsburg monarchy, Poland-Lithuania, Venice, and eventually Russia. Their goal was not compromise or negotiated borders. They sought something far more ambitious, the complete removal of Ottoman power from Central Europe. Hungary, long contested and deeply scarred by war, became the central battlefield of this counteroffensive. And year after year, the balance began to tilt. Before 1697, Habsburg armies under experienced commanders such as Charles of Lorraine and Louis of Baden steadily pushed Ottoman forces back. At the Second Battle of Mohacs in 1687, and again at Slankamen in 1691, Ottoman field armies were defeated in open combat. These were massive engagements involving tens of thousands of soldiers. Each loss tightened Habsburg control over Hungary and Transylvania, and with every defeat, the aura of Ottoman invincibility cracked a little more. By the mid-1690s, Emperor Leopold I could credibly claim that most of Hungary had returned to Habsburg hands. Politically, this mattered enormously. In an age where power was increasingly defined by standing armies, reliable taxation, and centralized administration, these victories elevated the Habsburgs into the highest ranks of European great powers. Yet the Ottoman Empire was not prepared to concede defeat. Not yet. In 1697, Sultan Mustafa II made a dramatic decision. He would personally lead a major campaign to recover lost ground. This was no routine gesture. By this period, Ottoman sultans rarely commanded armies in the field. The choice itself revealed how dire and how serious the situation had become. The scale of the undertaking was immense. Contemporary estimates placed the Ottoman force between 50,000 and 100,000 men. Even the lower figure represents a colossal army by 17th century standards. Alongside them marched nearly 200 artillery pieces, massive guns that required teams of oxen and sprawling supply trains to move. This was not a limited operation or a cautious probe. It was a calculated gamble to erase a decade of defeat in a single campaign. Operational command fell to the Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, while Mustafa II accompanied the army in person. They departed from Belgrade, crossed the Danube, and advanced northward along the Tisa River toward Transylvania. On paper, the strategy was sound: reclaim lost territory, restore Ottoman prestige, and reassert dominance in lands that had once seemed permanently secured. But beneath the surface, a critical problem went unnoticed, one that never appears on campaign maps. While the Ottomans were attempting to reclaim the past, the Habsburgs had been constructing something entirely new. Decades of pressure from Ottoman expansion had forced the Habsburg state to modernize, slowly, unevenly, and often at great cost. Tax systems were reformed to sustain permanent armies. Command structures became more professional. Training, logistics, and coordination were standardized. These changes lacked drama, but they proved decisive. By 1697, command of the Habsburg forces rested with Prince Eugene of Savoy. His army was far from flawless. Discipline issues and financial strain remained, but Eugene moved quickly to address them. Training intensified. Marching formations became tighter. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were taught to fight as a single, integrated force rather than as separate arms. That integration changed everything. Disciplined infantry could hold ground under pressure. Cavalry could maneuver and exploit weaknesses. Artillery, more mobile and accurate than earlier in the century, could shatter enemy formations at critical moments. This was organization transformed into battlefield power. And it was about to collide head-on with an empire still fighting the wars of its past. After advancing north along the Tisa, Sultan Mustafa II made a decision that would seal the fate of his army. He ordered the force to cross the river near the town of Zenta, intending to push onward toward Transylvania. On a campaign map, the choice looked logical. Rivers were the highways of the early modern world, and crossing here shortened the march. But maps hide reality. In the 17th century, a river crossing was one of the most dangerous maneuvers any army could attempt, especially when that army numbered in the tens of thousands. Consider the scale for a moment. Artillery pieces had to be hauled forward. Ammunition wagons creaked under their weight. Supply carts, horses, servants, engineers, and camp followers stretched the column for miles. It was an entire city on the move. And while that city was divided by a river, it could not fight as a single force. That moment, when half the army stands on one bank and half on the other, is when everything must work perfectly. For the Ottomans, almost nothing did. The first and most fatal failure was reconnaissance. Ottoman scouts completely failed to locate Prince Eugene's Habsburg army. They had no idea where he was. And this was no minor oversight. Eugene was maneuvering with a force of roughly 50,000 men. An army of that size should leave signs, dust clouds, campfires, noise, movement. Yet somehow it slipped through unseen. While Ottoman engineers assembled the crossing, Eugene marched out from Petrovaradin, crossed the Tisa himself, and advanced upstream along the eastern bank undetected. The fact that a hostile army of that size could approach without warning reveals something critical. Ottoman intelligence and forward security had badly decayed. And the Ottomans wouldn't realize this until it was far too late. Eugene reached the Ottoman position at the worst possible moment, right in the middle of the crossing. The army was using a pontoon bridge, a floating structure made from roughly 60 boats lashed together. It worked well enough in calm conditions. Under pressure, it was dangerously fragile. Then came the intelligence breakthrough. Eugene captured an Ottoman prisoner. One interrogation changed everything. The prisoner revealed that Sultan Mustafa II, along with much of the cavalry, the Spahi, had already crossed safely. But the heart of the army had not. Most of the infantry, including the Janissaries, remained on the near bank. The elite core of the Ottoman force was packed together, partially disorganized, and shielded only by a thin defensive line of wagons hastily chained into place. The Ottoman army was split in two. At that moment, Eugene faced a choice. He could wait. He could maneuver. He He could attempt a more cautious engagement later. Or he could strike immediately, before the infantry crossed, before the army reunited, before the Ottomans even understood what was happening. He chose to strike. Late in the afternoon of September 11th, 1697, Eugene launched a sudden, concentrated attack. The timing was deliberate. Late-day assaults leave no margin for recovery. If things go wrong, there is no daylight left to restore order. Panic spreads faster. Commands dissolve. Confusion multiplies. The Ottoman infantry was still compressed behind its wagon barrier, a common field fortification of the era. Hundreds of carts, chained together, formed a rough wall. It could work, but only if time was available. Eugene gave them none. The assault began head-on. Habsburg infantry advanced directly toward the wagon line as artillery opened fire at close range. Cannonballs ripped through wood, bodies, and tightly packed formations. Ottoman guns, still being repositioned during the crossing, were overrun, silenced, or abandoned. Within minutes, the defensive line meant to protect tens of thousands began to buckle and collapse. But that was only half the plan. At the same time, Eugene unleashed the decisive blow. His left wing executed a daring maneuver, crossing the Tisa at shallow sandbanks. This was no orderly bridge crossing. It was a rapid, dangerous plunge through water waist-deep in places. Once across, these troops swung behind the Ottoman position. Suddenly, the Ottomans understood. They were being crushed from multiple directions. Infantry and artillery pressed from the front. New enemy units appeared on their flank and then their rear. What followed was a classic double envelopment. Ottoman infantry, including elite Janissary units, was driven step by step toward the river, and the terrain turned disaster into catastrophe. The Tisa River, which had been an obstacle moments earlier, now became a trap. With the water directly behind them, retreat was impossible. There was no space to regroup, no room to withdraw in formation. The pontoon bridge quickly clogged. Soldiers surged forward. Others tried to turn back. Artillery wagons jammed the approach. Fear did the rest. This is why river crossings so often appear in stories of military disaster. Geography magnifies chaos. Eugene understood that, and he exploited it without hesitation. As pressure intensified, panic took over. Ottoman soldiers rushed toward the pontoon bridge, their only real escape. Under fire, with thousands trying to cross at once, the bridge became a death funnel. Habsburg artillery and musket fire focused relentlessly on the crossing. Men were struck mid-stride. Others were shoved into the river by the weight of the crowd behind them. Horses reared. Wagons blocked passage. Then the bridge failed. Under the strain, it collapsed. What followed was mass death. Armored soldiers sank almost instantly. Others were cut down by cannon fire while struggling in the water. Contemporary accounts describe bodies packed so tightly that the river's surface was barely visible. Fighting continued into the evening as Habsburg troops methodically destroyed trapped Ottoman units along the riverbank. By nightfall, Zenta was no longer a battle. It was a slaughter. The collapse did not stop with the common soldiers. In the chaos, Grand Vizier Elmas Mem Pasha attempted to restore order. He tried to impose discipline, to organize a withdrawal, to salvage something, anything from the catastrophe. Instead, he was killed by his own men. Panicked Janissaries turned on him in fury and fear. He was strangled with a bowstring, the traditional method of execution, right there on the battlefield. Several other high-ranking pashas and governors died the same day. And this moment matters far beyond Zenta. The murder of the Grand Vizier by mutinous troops was not just battlefield violence. It was a visible sign of something deeper, an empire whose military discipline, authority, and internal cohesion were beginning to collapse. By the late 17th century, the Janissaries were no longer the force they had once been. Chronic financial strain, delayed wages, and deep political interference had steadily hollowed out their discipline. They had become a body that bargained with authority, protested openly, and at times rebelled outright, especially during succession crises, when newly crowned sultans were expected to deliver enormous payouts to secure loyalty. What Zenta revealed was something strikingly modern. Timely intelligence could outweigh sheer numbers. Prince Eugene of Savoy did not defeat the Ottomans by mass alone. He won by identifying the precise moment of vulnerability and acting before it vanished. In the end, the catastrophe was not simply the result of a poorly executed river crossing. It was the collision of two systems. On one side stood an Ottoman army still rooted in tradition, numerical strength, and inherited momentum. On the other stood a Habsburg force driven by coordination, intelligence, and decisive leadership. The Ottomans never truly saw their enemy. Eugene saw everything, and once that narrow window opened for a few critical hours along the Tisa River, it never closed again. Reports from the Holy League put Habsburg losses at 429 killed and 1,598 wounded. That was the full toll. Out of an army of roughly 50,000 men, fewer than 2,100 became casualties. In percentage terms, fewer than 4 out of every 100 were hit, and less than 1 in 100 were killed. Keep that figure in mind because on the Ottoman side, losses are estimated at around 30,000 killed, wounded, or drowned. Even assuming the lower estimate of Ottoman strength, about 50,000 men, that still means more than half the army was eliminated in a single afternoon. If the higher figure of 100,000 soldiers is closer to reality, nearly 1 in 3 never return home. Technology played a role, particularly artillery. Habsburg guns were more mobile, better positioned, and far more tightly integrated with infantry movements than their Ottoman counterparts. But technology alone cannot explain why one side lost a few hundred men while the other lost tens of thousands. The decisive factor was timing and position. Ottoman troops were caught mid-crossing, compressed into narrow spaces, unable to maneuver, retreat, or even form proper battle lines. When artillery fires into a dense mass of men who cannot move, casualties rise with horrifying speed. Add panic, drowning, and collapsing bridges, and the numbers, grim as they are, begin to make sense. Even Ottoman historians struggled with these figures. The chronicler Mehmed Razid expressed doubt about internal military reports and accused the Grand Vizier of inflating army numbers to mislead Sultan Mustafa II. That detail matters. It shows how deeply fractured the Ottoman command system had become. When leaders no longer know, or refuse to admit, how many men they command, coordination fails long before the first shot is fired. The losses were not only human. In material terms, Zenta was devastating. The Habsburgs captured all 200 Ottoman artillery pieces, years of investment lost in a single day. But the haul went far beyond guns. They seized the entire imperial war treasury, along with massive logistical reserves, roughly 9,000 wagons, 6,000 camels, and around 15,000 oxen. This was not just equipment. It was the economic skeleton of an army. Without it, the Ottomans could not quickly regroup or mount another campaign, even if manpower had been available. Then came the most humiliating loss of all. In the chaos, Habsburg troops captured the Sultan's seals, the imperial signets used to authorize commands and embody sovereign authority. In Ottoman political culture, these were not mere administrative tools. They symbolized legitimacy, presence, and divinely sanctioned rule. Losing them was tangible proof that the Sultan had fled and that imperial authority had fractured on the battlefield. Prince Eugene later presented these trophies, guns, treasure, and seals to Emperor Leopold I. It was a political message delivered not in words, but in metal and wax. The balance of power had shifted. The consequences did not end at Zenta. With the Ottoman field army effectively destroyed, nothing stood in Eugene's way. He pushed deeper, launching a follow-up raid into Bosnia that met almost no organized resistance. The campaign culminated in the sack of Sarajevo, a dramatic signal that Ottoman defensive systems in the region had collapsed entirely. Now step back and consider what Zenta truly changed. The real impact did not end on the riverbank. It reshaped Europe for the next 2 centuries. After Zenta, Ottoman ambitions in Hungary were finished, not paused, not delayed, but ended. The destruction of the field army left Sultan Mustafa II with no realistic alternative but peace. The empire no longer possessed the manpower, the finances, or the credibility to continue the war. 2 years later, on January 26, 1699, that reality was formalized with the Treaty of Karlowitz. It marked the largest territorial concession the Ottoman Empire had ever made. For the first time in its history, the empire accepted a permanent, negotiated retreat rather than a temporary setback. The Habsburg monarchy gained most of Hungary, along with Transylvania, Slovenia, and parts of Croatia. In practical terms, nearly the entire central Danube basin, territory contested for more than 150 years, passed decisively into Habsburg hands. For Austria, the transformation was immense. Hungary was no longer a vulnerable frontier. It became a secure core region. Tax revenues expanded. Recruitment pools grew. Defensive lines shifted hundreds of miles eastward. Almost overnight, the Habsburg state evolved from a power fighting for survival into one of Europe's dominant empires. The Ottomans lost far more than land. They lost momentum, prestige, and, most critically, the assumption that their empire was still expanding. From this point forward, Ottoman diplomacy focused increasingly on preservation rather than conquest. And here the story quietly widens. The long-term consequence of Zenta and Karlowitz became what historians later called the Eastern Question, a deceptively simple idea with enormous implications. What happens when a vast empire begins to decline, but does not collapse all at once? The Ottoman withdrawal from Hungary created a dangerous power vacuum in the Balkans. These were not empty territories, but densely populated regions filled with competing ethnic, religious, and political interests. As Ottoman authority weakened, outside powers moved in. The Habsburgs filled the western half of the vacuum first. But they were soon joined by Russia, which by the late 18th century positioned itself as protector of Orthodox Christians and pushed its influence southward. Now the stage was set. 2 rising European empires, Austria and Russia, advanced into the same fragile region, both at the expense of a declining Ottoman state. Every border adjustment, every rebellion, every diplomatic crisis added tension. None of it exploded immediately. Instead, it smoldered for decades. That slow-burning instability mattered. It fed directly into the alliance systems, nationalist movements, and unresolved Balkan tensions that finally erupted in 1914. And when you trace that chain backward from the trenches of a world war, through imperial rivalries and Balkan unrest, you eventually arrive at a quiet river crossing in 1697. Zenta did not merely end a war. It ended an era. And in doing so, it opened a question Europe would struggle with for the next 2 centuries.